Ok, tenemos al señor Alan Taylor, quien es un historiador americano especializado en la historia temprana de los Estados Unidos. Es el autor de numerosos libros como La historia colonial de los Estados Unidos y la Revolución americana y la República temprana. Desde 1995, él ha ganado 2 premios Pulitzer y un premio Bancroft. También fue finalista en los premios del Libro Nacional del Año para no ficción. En el 2020 también fue elegido en la Sociedad Filosófica Americana. El señor es Alan Shaw Taylor. Por favor, Riley, saludemos al señor Taylor.
Professor Taylor, thank you for joining us. Welcome to CEPA's Exiles.
Thank you for having me on.
So something that we were particularly keen to talk with you about is your book, American Revolutions, A Continental History. Because, I mean, we've all heard about the American Revolution, Colombians included, and but what your book does is, as the subtitle, Continental History 1715-1804 would suggest, is that it expands the scope of the event both in time and space. Can you talk about why you chose to write such an expansive book?
Well, the story of the American Revolution ordinarily has been told, as you indicated, in a pretty narrow way that focused on just 13 of the British colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America, and did not consider the many ways in which the entire continent of North America, and indeed also all of the Americas, affected that revolution. The classic story of the revolution has been very much told as a Americans versus British story, but it's in reality a much richer story that involved many native peoples and involved the other empires, the French, of course, but also the Spanish. And the Spanish role in the American Revolution has been underplayed. And I think if we're really going to understand the American Revolution, we need to broaden the scale to look at all of the Americas and all of the participants, not just the British and the American participants, but also the Spanish and the native peoples and the French.
Muy bien, Riley hacía una pregunta acerca del por qué comenzamos con la Revolución Americana, y nos dice el señor Alan Taylor que de cierta manera se ha estudiado la Revolución Americana de una manera muy delgada, de una manera muy cerrada. Casi siempre se habló de las 13 colonias americanas. Por lo general solo se hablaba de la costa de los Estados Unidos y de la lucha entre los americanos y los británicos, pero no se tomó más en cuenta lo que fue el continente profundo, el continente amplio. También cómo afectó a los americanos de ese continente hacia adentro. También tenemos que no solo estaban en América, estaban los británicos, sino también los franceses y los españoles que interactuaron y fueron importantes al momento de la Revolución Americana.
Right, so you mentioned France and Spain and their role. Can you talk a bit about the role that those two empires played in the American Revolution?
Well, the United States begins as a rebel movement, and so they are creating the structures of a government and of an army and of a navy from scratch. And in the 18th century, navies were especially important for any imperial competition in North America, South America. They're very expensive. And so the United States is on the defensive so long as it does not have the assistance of another power with an established navy. The British Navy is the best navy in the world. It's the largest, most powerful, best prepared. But the number 2 naval power in the world was France, and the number 3 was Spain. And France and Spain had, throughout most of the 18th century, been allies against the British Empire. They had lost a big war with the British during the 1750s and early 1760s. And so both the French and the Spanish were very keen to try to redress an imbalance in the balance of power in Europe and the world by having a go at the British Empire, if the conditions were right. And so they're watching very carefully this rebel movement in North America during 1775 and 1776 to assess to see whether it has any staying power. And meanwhile, that rebel movement is very keen to get French and Spanish help. But they've got to hang in there and fight against the British Empire during 2 hard years of war and on into a third in 1777 in order to impress the French and the Spanish that this rebel movement was a credible movement and one that could hold its own. But and finally, in the middle of 1777, or I should say toward the end of 1777, the French are persuaded. The Spanish aren't yet. The Spanish have more complicated reasons that they are a little wary of assisting an independence movement in North America, lest it set a precedent that would be contagious and could be seized upon by people in South America and Central America, part of the Spanish Empire, that they would seize upon the North American precedent in order to potentially mount their own revolutions. So the Spanish are much more reluctant partners with the American revolutionaries, whereas the French are much more enthusiastic and plunge in right away in early 1778 and make an alliance with the Americans and then hope they can bring the Spanish after them.
Muy bien, Riley preguntaba acerca de cuál fue el papel del imperio francés y el imperio español, porque durante el siglo XVIII, y nos dice nuestro invitado Alan Taylor que en ese entonces había una competencia de imperios. En ese entonces el imperio número 1 o el imperio más fuerte en lo que tiene que ver con su armada era el imperio británico, después estaba el imperio francés y después estaba el imperio español. Obviamente ellos habían tenido luchas en contra de los británicos, sobre todo los franceses y los españoles, en los cuales los británicos, por así decirlo, derrotaron a estos dos imperios. Así que durante el año 1775-1776, los americanos intentaron que ingresaran a apoyar su revuelta en contra de los británicos, a los franceses, a los españoles, los invitaron porque de cierta manera era muy costoso tener una armada para poder luchar o hacerle frente a los británicos. Así que los franceses inicialmente en el 1777 decidieron apoyar, de cierta manera esperaron para saber si la revuelta o la revolución tenía forma y valdría la pena apoyarlo para que no fuera simplemente una revuelta pasajera. Así que los franceses entraron en 1777, mientras los españoles, por así decirlo, esperaron un poco porque eran cautelosos, ya que ellos veían que si se empezaba a mover un movimiento independentista en Norteamérica, puede ser contagioso para sus colonias en Centroamérica y Suramérica y podía de cierta manera contagiar un sistema de revoluciones y caer como un dominó, si se puede decir, sus colonias en Centro y Suramérica.
So, in your book, you mentioned the Comuneros Rebellion, something that we're all very familiar with here because it was an event that culminated in our city. It was here that the Spanish officials made their concessions to the Comuneros. You write in your book that the Viceroy of New Granada blamed the influence of the American Revolution for the rebellion. To what extent was there influence of the revolution in Latin America during the time?
Well, I would say the direct influence would be minimal. So it's not that they were that the comuneros were in communication with American leaders, or that American leaders were paying much attention to what was going on in New Granada. But it's more the notion that there's a precedent, that there is a revolution going on, and it's vaguely understood that there's a revolution going on in North America, and that it was enjoying some surprising military success, and that the French were directly aiding it, and the Spanish were indirectly aiding it. So, and there's a broad understanding that there are parallels, some parallels between the two situations, in that the comuneros are very upset at an effort to centralize the Spanish Empire, to increase taxation, and to increase the power of metropolitan officials over the colonists, and especially at the expense of colonial elites. But these taxes bear especially hard, though, on common people. And so it's the comuneros have their own grievances that they are acting on. And then they know, oh, by the way, it turns out it is possible to challenge the imperial power. The North Americans are doing this, so why not us? That sort of seems how the reasoning worked.
Muy bien. Preguntaba Riley acerca de la influencia de la Revolución Comunera en, digámoslo así, en la Revolución Americana, y nos dice nuestro invitado Alan Taylor que, digámoslo así, que fue mínima, pero sin embargo fue un precedente, ya que fue algo sorpresivo esta revolución que se estaba cocinando con unos cuantos ganancias, digamos así, en batallas, pero sin embargo eran dos revoluciones bastante paralelas, ya que aquí crecía el descontento, sobre todo por la aplicación de nuevos impuestos sobre la población, local, y lo mismo ocurría en los Estados Unidos. Entonces digamos que había un tipo de familiaridad entre las dos revoluciones y cómo se empezó a cocinar eso. Y adiciona el señor Alan Taylor que, digámoslo así, que desde Latinoamérica se miraba hacia arriba cómo se le hacía frente a un imperio. Era sobre todo el miedo tal vez que se tenía a este lado de nuestro continente, porque pues enfrentarse a un imperio de la noche a la mañana no es tan sencillo. Yo creo que nuestros oyentes deberían de ponerse en la situación presente como quien quisiera en este momento tener una lucha contra los Estados Unidos, que sería el imperio actual. Lo mismo ocurría en ese entonces con por así decirlo, nuestro continente.
I think Sebastian has a question.
Yeah. Nice to meet you, Mr.
Taylor.
Please call me. Nice to meet you.
I have a question. In your research of the effects to the revolution in Latin America, did you come to Colombia?
I wish I had, but I did not.
Okay. Why?
So the type of book that I wrote is one where I read the works of lots of other historians who are specialists, and I then try to synthesize it into a book that will cover some 54 years of time and cover 2 continents. So while I wish to go to every place that was involved in the story, life is short. And although I found very interesting the story of the Comuneros and other stories like Tupac Amaru and Quechan rebellion in what is now California, and work them in, they occupy 3 or 4 pages in a book of more than 400 pages, which is trying to cover lots of different topics.
Muy bien.
To my credit, I can say that that's 4 more pages than any North American historian would do. But have I done full justice to the story of the Spanish-American part of this? No, I didn't.
Preguntaba a Sebastián, al señor Taylor, si usted alguna vez había estado en Colombia y pues infortunadamente el señor Taylor dice que no pudo visitar nuestro país debido a que su libro era bastante específico y era una época muy corta de 54 a 55 años más o menos que abarca su investigación, una investigación muy específica, pero que pues obviamente le gustaría, entiende que aquí hubo movimientos muy interesantes como el levantamiento Quechua y el levantamiento Tupac Amaru. Y sin embargo, pues la vida es corta, pero aún así, si se presenta la oportunidad, ya que en su libro tuvo algunas páginas acerca de la revolución comunera en nuestro país, pero si se presenta la oportunidad, claro que él vendría aquí a visitarnos. Adelante.
We've addressed a question from a Colombian standpoint now. I'd like to address a question from an American West standpoint, which is with your book, you expand the revolution into the American West, and which is something that I like because when I was growing up in Washington State, we were always kind of, when we were taught about the American Revolution, it was kind of presented in that narrow Atlantic seaboard view that you were talking about. So can you talk a bit about the effects of the revolution in the West?
Sure. So the big story in the West in this period of time is the expansion of Spanish influence along the Pacific coast of what's now California. So at the same time that British colonies on the East Coast of North America were beginning their rebellion, the Spanish are founding presidios and missions and ranchos along the coast of California because they're fearful if they don't do this that the Russians will be coming south from Alaska to occupy the region. And the Spanish officials are very fearful of anything that seems to be verging on the core of their empire, which begins with Mexico. So the Spanish concerns in this period of time, they have many. They have a vast empire, a very complex one with great internal difficulties and tensions. And they just don't want foreign powers to get in and start interfering. So they're occupying the west coast of North America at the same time that the east coast of North America is starting a rebellion against the British Empire. And the Spanish also occupy the Mississippi Valley, the western half of it, and they hold the city of New Orleans, which is perhaps the most strategic place in North America because it's located at the mouth of the Mississippi River and therefore controls all of the trade of the vast region upriver, up the Mississippi River, and up its many tributaries. So the Spanish are hoping that they can expand their buffer zone between Mexico and the other powers active in North America, including the new United States and the Russians who have occupied Alaska. So the Spanish have a very complicated relationship to the American Revolution. They welcome it in so far as it will weaken the British Empire, the great enemy of the Spanish Empire in the 18th century. But they're worried that this new nation, this new United States, is a very active, expansionist population that very well may sweep westward and threaten this buffer zone that the Spanish have established in the American West. But most of the people living in the American West aren't Spanish, and they're not North Americans. They're not British, they're not Russians. They're native peoples of many different native nations. They're not united, but they do share a common desire to hang on to their homelands and not be absorbed by any of the empires that are competing for power in North America.
Muy bien, preguntan a él acerca de cuáles fueron los efectos, siendo él de la costa oeste de los Estados Unidos, cuáles fueron los efectos de ese entonces de la Revolución Americana. nos dice nuestro invitado Alan Taylor que, por así decirlo, mientras que en la costa este se cocinaba la rebelión en contra de los británicos, en la costa oeste, digamos así que era un juego entre los españoles, quienes venían desde México, digamos así, subiendo, y quienes habían conquistado parte del valle del Mississippi y tenían unas posiciones estratégicas en Nueva Orleans, sobre todo porque era la salida del Mississippi y donde se comerciaba bastante. Y al norte estaban los rusos en lo que hoy se llama Alaska. Digamos así que se tenía ese miedo que bajaran los rusos y por otro lado tener a los españoles ascendiendo desde México y que ellos se expandiesen hacia el norte. En California en ese entonces, digámoslo así, que eran puntos como ranchos o fuertes en los que convivía la mayoría de la población, quien eran en su mayoría nativos americanos, no eran, por así decirlo, británicos o españoles, sino más que todo nativos americanos quienes veían de cierta manera como una amenaza a estos dos imperios o a las personas que pertenecían a estos imperios y quienes estaban decididos a defender su parte de continente o la parte de los Estados Unidos que a ellos les correspondía.
All right, so sort of going back to the East, in the war against the British, often kind of a traditional narrative tends to depict a united American people against the British. Was that the case?
Certainly not. The American Revolution is a civil war, and in that there's a substantial minority of the colonists. It may have been as high as 40% at certain points in the struggle. That minority supports the British Empire. The British Empire had provided a great deal of prosperity, a greater degree of civil liberties than was possible in any other empire, and had provided military security that was unparalleled among European empires in the Americas. So there were many people in British America who said, look before you leap. This is a very risky thing to do. They did not like the new taxes or the new centralizing measures introduced by the British Empire during the 1760s. But a fair number of Americans said, as much as we dislike these new measures, if those are the prices of staying part of this successful empire, we should reluctantly pay them. If the alternative is this leap into the unknown of creating an independent set of republics, and it's important to bear in mind that these 13 different colonies had not been united before. They're very different from one another. They have very robust prejudices against one another and no traditions of much cooperation. So there's a lot of concern that if they're independent from the British Empire, that they will end up at war with one another. And because of these different fears of losing the prosperity of the empire, of potential civil wars between these new states, it leads to a civil war in which you have on the one side the patriots who are seeking independence, and on the other side the loyalists who are seeking to restore the unity of the British Empire.
Muy bien, pregunta Riley acerca de qué tan unidos estaban los americanos en contra de los británicos. Pues él habla de que pues esto fue una guerra civil de cierta manera. Pero digamos que había dos puntos de vista que hay que tener muy en cuenta, y es la parte o punto de vista de los patriotas, quienes estaban en contra de ser una colonia y ser más independientes, y estaba la parte de los lealistas o los
loyalists.
Loyalistas, puede decir lealistas, ¿no? quienes querían restaurar, vivir o leales, ¿sí? Volver a formar parte del Imperio Británico. ¿Por qué se daba esta situación? Porque de cierta manera los los americanos tenían cierto nivel de prosperidad y cierto nivel de protección, y de cierta manera vivían bajo la protección o bajo el ala de un imperio que para ese entonces era bastante exitoso. Por así decirlo, ellos querían, cuando se hablaba de que hubo un incremento en los impuestos y hubo una centralización del gobierno, digamos así, que estas personas decían, bueno, estos son los precios que hay que pagar por ser parte de este imperio. Sin embargo, los patriotas estuvieron totalmente en desacuerdo, sobre todo las colonias, las 13 colonias, que eran muy diferentes unas de otras y no tenían una tradición de cooperación, y además que tenían miedo a una guerra civil.
So we've talked about the divisions between patriots and loyalists. Now, what kinds of divisions or differences in goals or vision were there between patriots themselves?
There's a great range of hopes about what the revolution will bring. This is a very diverse movement. It's a coalition that involves people from different classes. In some cases, there's racial difference. This is primarily a movement by white men with the support of but there are some Native American allies, and particularly in the northern states, there is considerable African American participation in support of the revolution. While in the southern states, there is much African American opposition to the revolution because they see an opportunity to escape from slavery by running away to the British forces and helping them in the war. Within the leadership of the revolution, which is primarily drawn from people with some property, some considerable property, often that property includes enslaved human beings. And so the top leaders of the revolution, some of them are more conservative, and they're hoping this will just be a movement for independence, in which they will create a new nation, but they will preserve the social order, the social structure that they benefited from as people who are at the top of that society. But there are other leaders who were more liberal, who said, if we are creating an independent country, we also have to create a new form of government, a republic, in which sovereignty, we imagine, is invested in something called the people. And when you do that, that raises the question of who are the people? Are the people just white men? Do the people also include African Americans? Do they include Native peoples? Do they include women? So all of these questions suddenly pop up. And there are some people who are quite radical in saying we need to think about our society in new ways, and we need to expand our definition of who the people are, so that there will be true equality of opportunity that will expand beyond just the people who have enjoyed economic opportunity in the past. So the revolution raises lots of new questions within North American society, and this leads to some very detailed and emotional debates about how much social change is safe within this movement. Will it undermine the struggle against Great Britain, which required unity? And so it's a very interesting revolution to see how people are, on the one hand, pushing for greater change, and then other people are saying, hold back here, because the most important thing is to maintain some internal stability so that we can all win this struggle for the independence of these 13 new states.
Muy bien, la pregunta que hacía Riley era cómo era, si había divisiones dentro de los patriotas que encabezaron de cierta manera la revolución. Nos dice el señor Alan Taylor que era bastante diversa el liderazgo que tienen ellos, ya que tenían una coalición de clases. También habían afroamericanos y de otro lado habían personas que querían ejercer la esclavitud. Entonces digamos que no llegó un momento determinado en que se hizo la pregunta de qué se quiere con esta revolución. Si queremos un orden social, una estructura, o si queremos una república. Y la pregunta sobre todo más allá era de quién es la sociedad. Si nos vamos a expandir, quién es la gente. El debate era acerca de como tal, qué somos la sociedad, porque también podrían participar mujeres, hombres, negros, nativos. Entonces, digamos que hubo una especie de choque entre los liderazgos de estas personas patriotas, quienes querían, buscaban la independencia, pero también buscaban encontrar una identidad propia para saber quiénes eran. Así que Riley, por favor, despida a su invitado, por favor.
Okay, so I'm being told that we're running out of time. Now, as a concluding question, because this is because you've written about the revolution in a context beyond the United States, if there's one thing about the American Revolution that you think people around the world should know, what would that be?
One thing that they should know about it, that it was well, let me just back up and say that often the American Revolution is cast by North Americans as being the orderly revolution, the one that's unlike other revolutions in the world. So there's a certain self-congratulatory tone to the usual history of the American Revolution, which says that North Americans were uniquely able to create a revolution that stabilized very quickly and produced a successful nation. Now, that's not entirely false. There are ways in which the American Revolution is considerably less internally destructive than, say, the French Revolution, and had less internal difficulties than many of the Latin American revolutions. But by casting it in such a polarized way, to say there's one orderly revolution and then all of these messy other revolutions elsewhere in the world, it obscures the degree to which there was, in fact, lots of internal division and internal violence within the American Revolution. And that we need to see the American Revolution on a spectrum of revolutions, not as some sort of unique, distinctive revolution different from all the others.
Okay, la última pregunta que hacíamos era ¿qué podemos decirle a todas las otras, o qué identifica como, o qué se puede encontrar como único de la Revolución Americana? Y nos dice Alan Taylor que a diferencia de muchas otras revoluciones fue bastante única la Revolución Norteamericana debido a que se pudo crear una estabilización bastante rápida y sobrepasaron las dificultades, hubo un debate interno, no hubo tanta violencia y en el espectro, digámoslo así, de como sociedad se organizó bastante rápido y se trató de dirigir hacia un bien común. Es más o menos lo que nos decía nuestro invitado Alan Taylor, así que por favor, Riley, si podemos despedirlo.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. We love having American historians come on. You're not the first one, but you are the first to have written about the Comuneros in a book about American history.
Okay, well, hopefully there'll be more in the future.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much. We loved hearing what you had to say. This coming from an audience from a group of mixed nationalities. I don't know what book you're working on now, but I look forward to reading it. I just read Thomas Jefferson's Education. So thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much.
Muy bien, seguimos con nuestra programación habitual. Son las 5:03 de la tarde y ya viene con nosotros el concejal Juan Guillermo.